Hi everyone, Bond and I have been producing Dr. Pennsylvania for a bit over a year now, and we appreciate you giving us a listen. Our episodes can be found on iTunes, iHeartRadio, and numerous other places where podcasts are heard. If you haven't already, check out our Facebook page, which is regularly growing with historic images as well as photographs we've taken ourselves. We're always interested in looking for new stories and contributors, and we can be contacted on Facebook, as well as at our email, drpennsylvania@gmail.com. Thanks again. Ten or so years ago, I came across a book, Pennsylvania Mountain Stories. The book, stories supposedly collected by a college student while touring the central and northern tier regions of Pennsylvania, was originally published in the first years of the 20th century. I was hooked on the book and I passed it around to friends who all responded in a similar manner. Problem came up later when we were collectively researching the man himself and found that a good deal of the stories were fabricated. The man is Henry W. Shoemaker, and though this definitely tarnished the feelings about the stories, our actual response to the author himself was more complicated than that, for Shoemaker went a long way into documenting and preserving Pennsylvania's unique culture and natural beauty, and thereby doesn't leave a legacy which can be completely scrapped. In fact, if you've ever stopped to read the Pennsylvania historical markers, as you should, you've likely already read something of his writing. We've spoken about Shoemaker in the past. In fact, our first episode is Shoemaker's Lost Treasure, which compares two tales of lost gold in the hills of north-central Pennsylvania, and while one of the tales has certainly spread by word of mouth, it bears too close a resemblance to a story we've read in one of Shoemaker's books for it to be coincidentally similar. In fact, everything we do on this podcast type thing has been directly influenced by two writers, Shoemaker and James York Glim, who regrettably passed away in 2000. We'll speak about Glim in the future, as Bond and I have been trying to get his books, particularly Flatlanders and Ridge Runners and Snakebite, Lives and Legends of Central Pennsylvania, into the hands of anyone around us who is fortunate enough to be capable of reading. So who was Henry Wharton Shoemaker? Well, he was a lot of things. Notably, he was Pennsylvania's first state folklorist, serving in that position from 1948 until 1956. But Shoemaker's life doesn't begin in Pennsylvania. Rather, it starts in New York City on February 24th, 1880. Having the foresight to be born into more comfortable standards, his grandfather, John Wise Shoemaker, was an early investor in Pennsylvania's coal boom, specifically in anthracite operations in the Schuylkill County area. Henry Francis Shoemaker, the son, was a Syracuse graduate and Civil War veteran, having seen action at Gettysburg and Shiloh. Henry Francis would become a railroad magnate, investor, and close friend to high-ranking politicians. Henry's mother as well was connected to both Pennsylvania and the powerful railroad juggernaut of the 19th century. Blanche Quiggle was the only daughter of railroad tycoon Colonel James W. Quiggle. James Quiggle was more than this, though. He was a powerful man who rose from the wilds of Pennsylvania's Clinton County in the first quarter of the 19th century to become a lawyer and later a state senator, beginning in 1852, the same year he changed the family name from Quickle to Quiggle, which to my ears sounds a bit sillier. Blanche herself was well educated in both Philadelphia and Europe. She was also able to trace her family origins in Pennsylvania back to Richard Buffington, one of the earliest settlers, and, in fact, worked directly with William Penn. The Shoemaker family moved to an exclusive neighborhood in New York City in 1878, 2 years prior to Henry's birth. The house on West 53rd Street was a 5-story affair nearby the homes of John D. Rockefeller and William K. Vanderbilt, to name a couple. I tried to find the house while in New York City, but it has been torn down and replaced by a low-rise built in 1963. The site of the home is only 2 blocks from Trump Towers, and while in this era every neighborhood of Manhattan is rather exclusive, I think its proximity to Rockefeller Plaza, Trump Tower, and Central Park suggests that it's still a high-end address. It's difficult to look upon the area and see 1880, especially considering John D. Rockefeller's statement that when the Shoemakers first came to New York City, the neighborhood was, quote, far more like a country than a city. In the beginning, the houses were scattered. There were ledges of rock between them, and the trees were plentiful. Henry would be the oldest child born to Francis and Blanche Shoemaker. He would have a younger brother, William, and a sister also named Blanche. Only 6 years separated Henry from his youngest sibling. Through their childhood, the children would hear tales of the old home state of Pennsylvania. Their father was, in fact, vice president of the Society for Pennsylvanians living in New York City. Most summers, the family would travel to the matriarchal family estate, Restless Oats, which still stands near Macklehattan, between Lock Haven and the Jersey Shore. Though don't mistake it for the restaurant of the same name. Henry had a special fondness for this home and would pass away there in 1958, but that's getting ahead a bit. Of his time there as a youth, Shoemaker is quoted as saying, "Those early impressions decided my whole life, as I have been ever a loyal son of Pennsylvania." Henry would attend a prestigious classical school, where he would hone a love of classical mythology, French art, and literature. It was during this period that he traveled to Europe and was inspired by the arts, particularly the reverence of folklore. It awakened in him a drive to scholarly work which Simon Bronner, in his biography of Shoemaker, popularizing Pennsylvania, Henry W. Shoemaker and the Progressive Uses of Folklore and History, cites as a striking dichotomy of Shoemaker. As a youth, Henry Shoemaker was a model of physical strenuosity in the great outdoors and of the intellectual bookishness in the Victorian library. His father wrote him, "I have adapted your plan in part and am taking lots of exercise in the open air. I walk and I drive over and around the mountains, and barring horseback riding, am doing about what you would do if you were here. I am very sorry you could not accompany me, as it is the kind of life and amusement that you are fond of." At 17, Henry would enroll at Columbia University, which was less than 5 miles from his family's New York estate. Though he would leave prior to earning a degree, Henry would utilize his connections with the Roosevelt family in order to secure a post as Secretary of the American Legation, Costa Rica, and Lisbon. The following year, his post would move to the American Embassy in Berlin. Henry would return to the United States in 1905, as he was adamant about making a splash in business and establishing a name for himself separate from the successes of his father and other relations. He established the Shoemaker, Bates & Company brokerage firm alongside his younger brother William, and a classmate from Columbia. There was initial success and notoriety, especially as Henry would purchase his first newspaper as the partnership was opening. The venture was short-lived, however. One day at their offices in the Blair Building, located across Broad Street from the New York Stock Exchange, William Shoemaker was badly injured in an elevator mishap. He would die shortly afterwards. The partnership was dissolved in 1911, but Henry was hardly directly involved following his brother's death, citing that, in part due to the accident, that he had lost interest in the world of high finance. Perhaps another reason for Henry's withdrawal from the high-profile life of New York society came as a result of an ugly divorce and custodial arguments which followed, and were even played out in the front pages of the New York Times. Meeting in Pennsylvania in 1905, Henry would marry Beatrice Barclay in 1907, having a child, Henry Francis, in 1908. Beatrice left for Seattle later that very year and filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment in 1910. She had changed the child's name and had him adopted by her new husband, and did not allow Henry Shoemaker to see the child. The Shoemaker clan stepped in and won in court, but the damage was done. In the biography, Bonner writes, "Prominent newspapers picked up the story, and on May 24, 1913, the New York Times featured the scandal on the front page. Shoemaker issued a statement criticizing the adoption for causing, quote, a lifetime of injustice to the boy because it would deprive him of the love and protection of his paternal relatives and his rightful inheritance," end quote. Although he won a victory in court, Shoemaker suffered from the publicity. Readers soaked up the story of the self-righteous progressive advocating social welfare but not attending to his own child. Newspapers' reports of the divorce among high society often implicated the individuals involved with a failure of morality. Newspaper coverage of the divorce tended to be negative and was often set against the background of a dramatic progressive era increase in the divorce rate in America and a debate over divorce law reform. In the debate, Shoemaker's Episcopal Church of New York took a hard line against divorce. Shoemaker's cousin Lily Crawford wrote him to assure him that he would not be stigmatized by the divorce. The divorce was ugly, and though it may have changed Henry Shoemaker's life significantly in that he was no longer quite the socialite he had once been, it failed to smother his diverse and somewhat eccentric interests, which appeared to be growing each day. Henry did marry again, this time to a woman outside of the New York social circle. Considering his first marriage, this was not surprising. Maybelle Ord was from a military family and had spent most of her life on the west coasts of California and Mexico. They were wed on May 10, 1913, 2 years prior to the divorce adoption scandal proceedings with his first wife, Beatrice, hit the front pages of the New York Times. The wedding of Shoemaker and Ord was covered by the New York Times as well, who noted that Henry's parents gifted him their house at 21 West 53rd Street, whose value at the time was more than $250,000. This was the single largest gifted real estate in the city. The house, translated to 2016 dollars, would have been valued at over $6 million, and that's not taking into account the increased value of property, only how much the 1913 value was, and then inflating it for today's currency. By the time Henry had married Maybelle, he had already purchased several newspapers in Pennsylvania, including the Altoona Tribune, which he bought in 1912. 8 years later, he would also purchase the Altoona Times, but he was hardly monopolizing just the Altoona media, as he also owned papers in Bradford, Jersey Shore, and Reading. These newspapers were his first foray into folklore, and many of the stories that would appear in 1908's Pennsylvania Mountain Stories were originally published in the newspapers he owned. Other books followed, including Juniata Memories in 1915 and Allegheny Episodes in 1922. A prolific writer, the subjects of his books range from collected folk tales and oral histories to linguistic and zoological topics, but almost without exceptions, the stories were of Pennsylvania. In previous episodes, we've spoken to the Pennsylvania lumber industry and how large swaths of the northern tier and central regions of Pennsylvania were clear-cut, leaving behind a lunar landscape and threatening the remaining towns with periodic brush fires. Shoemaker's most prolific times coincide with the decline of the lumber industry. Shoemaker, a dedicated preservationist, saw his writing as a conserving effort. He stated that he hoped to create a reverence of the natural world around us, as previous cultures had, in the hopes that a somewhat spiritual connection with nature would lead to a culture which would tend to the earth more carefully. To a degree, this sentiment has been the first offensive argument for Shoemaker, who often created legends, whole cloth fabrications. One of the more infamous examples being the story of Princess Nittany. We'll cover the legend of Nittany some future episode, as well as the actual origins of the name. But so pervasive has the myth become that Penn State's own website addresses it, stating that Princess Nittany was invented by author and publisher Henry W. Shoemaker and has no basis whatever in fact. Shoemaker's mention of the princess first appeared in print around 1903. At that time, he attributed the tale to an aged Seneca Indian named Isaac Steele. Shoemaker, a well-known Pennsylvania folklorist, later admitted that both Steele and Nittany were purely fictitious. In 1924, Henry Shoemaker, alongside Bishop J. H. Darlington, founded the Pennsylvania Folklore Society, with which Shoemaker would be involved with until his death. Upon returning to the United States following a 3-year diplomatic post as foreign minister to Bulgaria, he reaffirmed his position as president of the society and would remain in that position for nearly 30 years. At the time, Shoemaker's reputation as a folklorist was quickly recognized, with Juniata University in Huntington County awarding him an honorary doctorate in 1917, and the Philadelphia North American published a story in 1920 under the banner of Pennsylvania Folklore, the life work of Colonel Henry W. Shoemaker, among other things. Shoemaker utilized the attention as a way to promote the preservation of folklore and that the state should play a role, citing the increased state interest in folklore in European countries, where it was seen as a way of cementing culture and crafting national identity. Shoemaker saw this firsthand while in Bulgaria. As he neared his 60s, Shoemakers was appointed state archivist by Governor George Howard Earl III. He served in this capacity from 1937 until 1948. Governor Earl also awarded Order of the Meritorious Service for Folklore Research in 1939. Shoemaker was also the director of the State Museum from 1939 to 1940, stepping down from the position as state archivist to assume the title of first state folklorist. He was charged with the creation of a division of folklore following the merger of the Archives, Museum, and Historical Commission into the present entity which we now know as the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, or, in the world of initialisms, the PHMC. Shoemaker retired from the position of Pennsylvania State Folklorist in 1956 around the age of 76. Younger, more academic folklorists had taken his place, including Eastern Pennsylvania's Alfred L. Shoemaker, of whom there is no known relation, and Western Pennsylvania's Samuel Bayard, both of whom were critical of Henry Shoemaker's willingness to create disreputable folklore, regardless of the intentions. Henry Warren Shoemaker retired to the family home of Restless Oaks and Macklehattan between Lock Haven and Jersey Shore. He would pass away there on July 15, 1958, and is buried in Lock Haven beside his second wife Maybelle, who died in 1967. Restless Oaks is still around today. My understanding is that it has been gutted and that the current owners are turning it into a bed and breakfast. There's also a Restless Oaks restaurant. I think I mentioned this before. It's nearby the old estate, and though I've yet to eat there, I've driven by it on a couple of occasions and I hope to find it open the next time I'm there. Today, Penn State maintains many of Shoemaker's manuscripts and other ephemera, as does Juniata College, which has a gallery named in his honor.